When Francisco de Orellana reached the Atlantic in 1542, he brought back a report that should have changed the history of South America forever. According to the men on that expedition, the Amazon was not wilderness. For weeks they had floated past settlements large enough to feed hundreds of soldiers, provinces controlled by named rulers, defensive fleets moving between communities, and stretches of riverbank where human habitation continued for hours without interruption. The Dominican friar Gaspar de Carvajal, who recorded the journey, described roads extending inland from the water, storage buildings filled with food, pottery workshops, marketplaces, and populations that, in some regions, appeared larger than anything the Spanish expected to find beyond the Andes. That account created a problem, because the next Europeans to travel the same river encountered something completely different. The settlements were no longer there. The organized river societies Carvajal described had vanished from the historical record so completely that later historians concluded the friar must have exaggerated what he had seen. For centuries that became the accepted explanation. The expedition had been starving. The men had been exhausted. The jungle had distorted their judgment. Case closed. Then archaeologists started finding engineered soils hundreds of acres wide, geometric earthworks hidden beneath the forest canopy, and settlement networks in exactly the regions Carvajal had described more than 400 years earlier. The question changed almost overnight. Not, why did the friar invent these cities? But, why were so many people so comfortable deciding he had? Because once you start following the expedition records between 1541 and the end of the 16th century, a pattern begins to appear. Again and again, the reports that caused the greatest political, economic or legal problems had a strange habit of disappearing into archives, summaries, accusations, and silence. And that raises a very uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the greatest disappearing act in Amazon history was not the civilization itself. Perhaps it was the memory of it. In February of 1541, Gonzalo Pizarro marched east out of Quito with one of the largest expeditions ever assembled in South America. The Inca Empire had fallen less than a decade earlier, and Spain had become addicted to rumors. Every mountain seemed to hide another kingdom. Every river supposedly led to another fortune. This expedition was chasing two of the most expensive rumors on earth. The first was cinnamon. Real cinnamon reached Europe from Asia and sold for enormous sums of money. When reports reached Spanish officials that forests of wild cinnamon existed somewhere beyond the Andes, the reaction was immediate. If Spain could find its own source, it could bypass the trade routes that made merchants rich and kings jealous. The second rumor was far more dangerous. Somewhere beyond the mountains, according to stories spreading through the colonies, there existed a kingdom so wealthy that its ruler covered himself in gold dust during ceremonies before washing it away in a sacred lake. The Spanish had already given him a name, El Dorado, the Gilded Man, and men crossed continents chasing less than that. Pizarro gathered soldiers, indigenous porters, horses, hunting dogs, livestock and supplies, and pushed east into territory that almost none of them understood. At first the expedition moved quickly. Then the mountains ended, the forest began, and almost immediately the entire operation started coming apart. The roads disappeared first, then the pack animals. Rain fell for weeks at a time, gunpowder spoiled, clothing rotted, food stores collapsed faster than anyone expected. The forests east of the Andes were unlike anything the Spanish had experienced in Mexico or Peru. There were no large stone cities to seize, no roads to follow, and no fields capable of feeding hundreds of hungry men moving together through the landscape. Every mile became more expensive than the last. By the end of the year, the expedition was surviving rather than exploring. Men were boiling leather, horses were dying. Entire sections of the column disappeared while searching for food. The land of cinnamon eventually appeared, but not in the form Pizarro had imagined. There were cinnamon trees, a few of them, scattered through the forest. No plantations, no fortunes, no reason to continue dying for the rumor that had brought them there. Then the expedition reached a river large enough to change history. Pizarro ordered Francisco de Orellana to take around 60 men and moved downstream in a newly built brigantine to search for food and make contact with settlements that might be willing to trade. The mission was simple: find food, return upriver, save the expedition. Instead, Orellana vanished. The current was stronger than expected, the river wider than expected, the settlements farther away than expected. Every hour spent searching for supplies carried the boat farther from the starving men waiting behind them. Returning against the current with exhausted crews and limited food became less realistic with every passing day. For Orellana, the choice slowly disappeared. There was no turning around, only downriver. Pizarro would later accuse him of betrayal, abandonment, desertion. Orellana would spend the rest of his life insisting that the river had made the decision for him. What neither man understood at the time was that this argument was about to become much larger than either of them. Because Orellana and the 60 men drifting east with him were about to become the first Europeans in history to cross the Amazon from the Andes to the Atlantic. And somewhere ahead of them waited the reason this story survived at all. Not gold, not cinnamon, not El Dorado. Something far more difficult to explain. Cities. Not one city, not two cities. An entire river system that, according to the man recording the journey, appeared to contain more people than anyone in Europe believed the Amazon could support. By the time the first large settlements appeared on the riverbanks, the expedition had almost stopped worrying about starvation. They had found something much bigger than food. The problem was that almost nobody would believe them when they got home. The first villages saved the expedition. By the time Orellana's brigantine entered the great river system, the men aboard had been starving for months. They had crossed mountains, cloud forests, and flooded lowlands looking for kingdoms that did not exist, and the expedition had already begun eating the things armies are never supposed to eat: leather, harness straps, boiled animal hide, anything that could survive in hot water long enough to become chewable. Then the canoes started appearing, small at first, one or two approaching the boat carefully from the shoreline, then villages, then larger villages, then something that forced Carvajal to begin writing differently. The settlements did not stop. One village appeared around a bend in the river and disappeared behind them. Another waited ahead, then another, then another. Hours passed. The pattern continued. Days passed. The pattern continued. Carvajal eventually stopped describing isolated settlements and began describing provinces. Named territories ruled by local leaders with populations large enough to organize defenses, gather food reserves, and control long sections of river. The image he recorded looks almost nothing like the Amazon most people imagine today. The riverbanks were active. Fishing canoes moved constantly between communities. Smoke rose from cooking fires along the shoreline. Large communal houses stood above the floodplain. Storehouses held dried fish, maize, turtle meat, and cassava, prepared for long storage. Trade moved up and down the river in both directions. The expedition was not floating through untouched wilderness. It was floating through somebody else's world. Carvajal described settlements stretching so far along the banks that the Spanish could leave one populated area and enter another before losing sight of the first. In one section of the river, he claimed the inhabited shoreline continued for an entire day of travel. Whether the distances were perfectly accurate almost misses the point. The important detail is scale. He was trying to describe populations far larger than anything Europeans expected to encounter in the interior of South America. And then came the roads. That detail caused problems for historians centuries later, because roads imply permanence. Roads imply planning. Roads imply administration. Carvajal repeatedly mentions routes leading inland from the river, some broad enough to move large groups of people and supplies through the forest. The Amazon of European imagination was supposed to be isolated communities separated by impossible distances. Road networks suggested exactly the opposite: connections, coordination, infrastructure. The further Orellana travelled, the more organised the river appeared to become. Some settlements sent food, others sent warriors. Messages moved ahead of the brigantine faster than the boat itself. By the time the Spanish reached certain sections of the river, entire communities were already waiting for them. The expedition had become news. Sometimes that news was good, sometimes it was not. Carvajal describes coordinated attacks involving large numbers of canoes approaching together from multiple directions, while signals moved along the shoreline using drums and horns. The Spanish had expected scattered resistance from isolated villages. What they encountered instead looked much closer to organized regional defense. The attacks became serious enough that the expedition spent long periods fighting while trying to keep the boat moving downstream. Arrows fell continuously. Armor became essential even in the tropical heat. Several men were wounded. Carvajal himself eventually lost an eye during one of the engagements. That detail matters because historians often ask whether he exaggerated what he saw. But exaggeration usually follows pride. Carvajal was recording hunger, panic, casualties, and military defeat. His account does not read like propaganda written by victorious conquerors. It reads like the journal of men realizing they were outnumbered in a place they had been told was empty. The most famous passage involved the women. Carvajal described female warriors fighting among the defenders with such aggression and authority that the Spanish compared them to the Amazons of Greek mythology. That comparison became so famous that it eventually gave the river its modern name. The Amazon River exists on modern maps because exhausted men in a wooden boat believed they had found warrior women in the interior of South America. By the time the expedition reached the Atlantic in August of 1542, Orellana and his men believed they had discovered something that would reshape European understanding of the continent. A navigable river crossing South America, populated interior provinces, agricultural systems capable of supporting very large communities, political organization extending across enormous distances. They expected arguments about numbers, arguments about locations, arguments about measurements. What they did not expect was that future generations would reject the entire picture. Because when Europeans returned to the same river decades later, they found something completely different. Not cities, not provinces, not crowded shorelines. Instead, they found the Amazon that still exists in popular imagination today. Trees, silence, distance, and that created a problem history struggled with for centuries. Either the men on Orellana's expedition had lied, or an entire human landscape had disappeared between one generation and the next. When Orellana returned to Spain, the argument started almost immediately. Not about the river. The river existed, not about the journey. Too many men had survived for anyone to deny that. The argument was about what they claimed to have seen while making it. Because if Carvajal was correct, then the Spanish crown had just learned something extraordinary. The interior of South America was not empty. It was occupied, not by scattered villages hidden under the canopy, by organized societies controlling territory, food production, trade routes and manpower on a scale that Europeans had not expected to find east of the Andes. That distinction mattered enormously in the 16th century, because discovery and conquest were not the same thing. Finding empty land and claiming it for the crown was one thing. Finding provinces already ruled by powerful leaders was another. The legal arguments surrounding indigenous sovereignty had already exploded across Spain following the conquest of Mexico and Peru. Theologians, lawyers, and royal officials were openly debating a question that sounds surprisingly modern. What rights did existing civilizations possess if Europeans arrived on their shores? The Amazon was not supposed to complicate that argument further. Carvajal's account did exactly that. Because once you accept cities, roads, and rulers, another word enters the conversation: ownership. And ownership changes everything. At almost exactly the same time, Orellana found himself fighting another battle. Gonzalo Pizarro had accused him of desertion. According to Pizarro, Orellana had stolen supplies, abandoned starving men, and escaped downriver while the rest of the expedition suffered in the mountains. Orellana insisted the river current had made returning impossible. The argument became political very quickly. because whoever controlled the story controlled the reward. Spanish law granted enormous privileges to men who discovered and claimed new lands for the crown. Governorships, tax rights, titles, labour systems, generational wealth. If Orellana had discovered a populated and wealthy river province, his future was very different from that of a disgraced officer accused of abandoning his commander. Suddenly, the credibility of the Amazon account mattered to everyone involved, especially the people who stood to lose from believing it. Then came the disaster that changed everything. Orellana secured permission to return. He planned to establish settlements and prove that everything he had described actually existed. If successful, the arguments would end immediately. Cities can argue for themselves. The expedition never had the opportunity. Ships failed, supplies disappeared, disease spread through the crews. By the time Orellana reached the mouth of the river again in 1546, the venture was collapsing around him. He died before establishing a colony. He died before proving the claims. He died before sending governors, tax collectors, and administrators back to Spain, with reports confirming what Carvajal had written. That may have been the single most important event in the history of the Amazon narrative, because after that moment, the greatest witness to the populated river was a dead explorer and a friar carrying a manuscript. And manuscripts are fragile things, especially when they create problems. Carvajal's chronicle did not become one of the great celebrated texts of the age. It circulated quietly, copied by hand, quoted in fragments, mentioned briefly in other works. The full account disappeared into archives and remained largely outside public discussion for centuries. For generations, historians learned about the Amazon from summaries rather than eyewitness testimony. And summaries have a strange habit of becoming smaller every time they are repeated. A large settlement becomes a village. A province becomes a tribe. A river civilization becomes a few scattered communities living in the forest. By the 18th century, the transformation was almost complete. The Amazon had become wilderness in the European imagination. Not because someone held a meeting and decided to erase it, because every institution that touched the story found the simpler version easier to live with. The Crown preferred empty frontiers. Settlers preferred vacant land. Administrators preferred uncomplicated maps. Even historians preferred a rainforest that matched the world they already thought existed. The inconvenient version demanded too many new questions. Questions about ownership. Questions about conquest. Questions about what exactly had happened to the millions of people Carvajal believed he had seen. Then the ground itself started becoming difficult to ignore. Black earth appeared where poor jungle soil should have been. Massive engineered landscapes emerged beneath the trees. Ancient roads began appearing from the air, and slowly historians found themselves facing a possibility they had spent centuries avoiding. What if the starving friar on the damaged boat had not exaggerated at all? What if he had simply arrived at the worst possible moment in history? Because if disease had already entered the river system before later expeditions arrived? Carvajal may not have been describing the Amazon at its height. He may have been describing it during its final years. For almost 400 years, historians believed the simplest explanation. Gaspar de Carvajal had exaggerated. The starving friar had mistaken villages for cities. His expedition had turned fear into memory and memory into myth. The problem with that explanation is that the ground eventually started disagreeing with it. The first clue appeared in the soil itself. Across huge areas of the Amazon, archaeologists kept finding patches of black earth that should not have existed naturally. The surrounding jungle soil was thin and poor. This soil was different, dark, rich, filled with charcoal, pottery fragments, fish bones, and organic material left behind by generations of human activity. Some deposits covered hundreds of acres. You do not accidentally create hundreds of acres of engineered soil. You create it by keeping large populations in one place for a very long time. Then came the earthworks. As forests were cleared during the 20th century, enormous geometric structures began appearing beneath the canopy. Circles, squares, causeways, defensive ditches, road systems connecting settlements that nobody knew had existed. The forest had hidden them so completely that they only became visible from the air. Some of them sat exactly where Carvajal had described major population centres almost 4 centuries earlier. Then archaeologists working in the Upper Xingu began mapping networks of settlements connected by roads and plazas arranged with remarkable planning and precision. Suddenly, the old friar's accounts started sounding less like fantasy and more like eyewitness testimony. Roads, large settlements, managed landscapes, regional organisation. The evidence was beginning to point in the same direction as the chronicle everyone had spent centuries dismissing. The question changed. Not, did Carvajal invent the cities, but what happened to them? Modern researchers believe the answer arrived before many Europeans ever did. Disease moved faster than ships, faster than horses, faster than explorers. Smallpox, influenza and measles travelled through trade networks long before many communities ever saw a European face. By the time later expeditions entered the Amazon, they were not seeing the world Carvajal had described. They were seeing what remained after epidemics had already passed through it. Perhaps that is why the Amazon looked empty to the men who came later, not because nobody had lived there, because millions already had. And the forest does not leave abandoned places exposed for very long. Give the jungle a few decades and roads disappear. Fields disappear. Plazas disappear. Give it a century and entire cities become trees. Maybe that is the real story hidden inside the expedition records between 1541 and 1600. The records were not dangerous because they described a lost civilization. They were dangerous because they described a civilization that should have still been there. Thank you for watching. And next time you see an endless sea of green stretching across the Amazon basin, remember this: green is not always the colour of wilderness. Sometimes it is the colour of cover.